Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Ottawa Jewish Historical Society's second Zoom program. I'm delighted so many of you could join us. We have a really amazing event planned for you tonight, which I hope will encourage all of you to frequent the Ottawa Jewish Archives when it's possible once again. There will be an opportunity at the end of each segment during this event for those of you who wish to ask questions about particular things from the archives that have been featured. I want all of you to know that as COVID-19 appears to be slowly disappearing off the face of the landscape, that we are hard at work planning for a bright future. Assuming that all the necessary criteria are established and met, we, the board of the Ottawa Jewish Historical Society, will be ready to move forward with regular in-person programming as soon as it is possible. There are a couple of things that we know you will all enjoy, and we will advise you when they're going to happen once we get the green light to get back to normal. Watch the newsletter and our Facebook page for up-to-the-minute information. At this point, I'd like to call on John Diener to explain how we're going to go about doing questions during this event. John?
Yes, Teigan is going to present a total of 12 objects from the archive. And what we're going to do is, after the first 6 are presented, there'll be an opportunity for questions and hopefully answers from Teigan. Probably the best way to pose the questions so that we don't have a lot of noise in the background is to put your questions in the chat box, and I'll monitor them. And then when we do the break, I'll read out the questions and Teigan can respond to them rather than having everybody sort of speaking on top of everybody else. So that's about it. Please stay muted so that we minimize any background noise. Thanks.
Thanks, John. Let's move along to our program. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Teigan Goldsmith, our wonderful archivist from the Ottawa Jewish Archives. She will show us tonight about some of the wonderful treasures that are in our archives. Thanks, Teigan. Now you've got it.
Perfect. All right. So, good evening, everyone. As Terry mentioned, my name is Teigan Goldsmith, and I'm the archivist at the Ottawa Jewish Archives. Tonight, I will be showcasing 12 items that we house in the archives, and I'll be telling you a little bit about their individual histories and the families that they come from. I encourage anyone who has stories or information that they would like to add to please feel free to do so either halfway through or after the presentation. I know quite a few of the families and the donors are in attendance tonight, so if you have anything that you would like to add or share, please feel free to do so. I always love when people have additions. So the purpose of tonight is, of course, to have a great time learning about the treasures that we have hidden within the Ottawa Jewish Archives collections vault, but this is also an opportunity for me as the archivist to remind everyone about the importance of keeping records. Archives are very fortunate in a sense that we mostly collect paper artifacts, meaning that our items speak for themselves quite literally through written word. The Ottawa Jewish Archives is unique in that we have quite a few 3D artifacts for an archive. The only reason that I'm able to share these artifacts with you tonight is because the people who donated them had the forethought to record their history. They donated the items with information and stories attached to them, which allow us to know their significance. While this may not be the case for everything in our collection, I am pleased to say that it is for the most. While listening tonight, I encourage all of you to look around your own homes and see the items that you have within them and consider their significance in terms of your story. So before we get started, I just wanted to tell you a little bit about the archives for anyone who may not be as familiar with us. So the archives is located in the Soloway JCC inside the Greenberg family's library. We're just behind the front desk for the library. This, however, has not always been our home. When the archives was first established, we had a small room in the Chapel Street JCC where items were sorted and stored. The archives was established in 1969, and its mandate is, quote, to strive to maintain the collective memory of the Jewish community of Ottawa through its objectives to acquire, preserve, and make accessible its holdings, which document the history, growth, and development of the Jewish community within Ottawa and the National Capital Region. That's basically a really winded way of saying that we collect items that pertain to Jewish Ottawa specifically. Our collection tells the story of community life in Ottawa, starting in the 1890s all the way up until the present day. Now, without further ado, I'd like to take us on a little trip to the past. This first item I'd like to tell you about is a garment which was worn by 3 different generations spanning almost 70 years. This is a brit milah, or a bris gown. It's worn by male babies on the 8th day of their life for their circumcision and the naming ceremony, also referred to as a bris. This gown in particular was worn by babies in the Goffman-Nadler family for their bris and naming ceremony in 1921, 51, 64, and 90. It was also used for the Hidian Haben ceremony, please excuse my pronunciation on that one, which is a redemption of the firstborn, a ceremony which takes place 1 month after the baby's birth. At this ceremony, the father redeems his firstborn son, giving 5 silver coins to a Cohen or a priest who is considered to be a direct male descendant of Aaron. This is a traditional Jewish ritual most commonly practiced among Orthodox and conservative Jews. This garment in particular was worn by Karl Goffman in 1921, Howard in 1951, Philip in 1964, and Haley in 1990. I believe that Haley would have worn the gown for her naming ceremony. Bris gowns like this one come in all shapes, sizes, and styles. So the design of this gown is intended to be comfortable for the baby while still being convenient for the procedure. This gown in particular is a similar style to christening gowns of the time, which, like a bris, is a ceremony welcoming a child to God and to their family, or into their religion, pardon me. Although we don't have a ton of information on the family in our collection, or this gown, having it in our collection to show an example of family tradition is really important. This gown is kept as a reference collection item and can be used as an example of the type of garment worn during this particular kind of ceremony. The second item that I'll be showing you tonight is a stereo viewer from the mid-20th century. This item was donated to the archives in August 2020 by David Kimmel, who I believe is in attendance tonight, as well as a few family members. So this stereo viewer comes complete with a box, slides, and a working light portion that was previously fixed by the donor. The stereo viewer is unique to our collection because it has photographic slides that show Schaefer's Limited, a department store that operated in Ottawa on Rideau Street for more than 50 years. The stereo viewer is a classic Brumberger stereo viewer that was traditionally sold in the 50s and 60s. These were manufactured by Brumberger Sales Corporation of Brooklyn, New York, who sold movie, darkroom, and archiving equipment in addition to these viewers. This particular style features black marble and gray coating. There's also a mounting portion on the bottom so that you could hold the viewer in place, and of course, the custom Schaefer slides, which if you look at the screen are the top left and right photos. Now, to understand the significance of this item, we need to talk about the Schaefer family. The Schaefer family history, for the purpose of this item, starts with Abraham Schaefer. Abraham was born in Albany, New York in 1885. He married Mary Baslaw in 1907, and they had 5 children together: Irving, Harold, Milton, Sheldon, and Beatrice. In the early 1900s, they moved to Ottawa, and in February of 1911, they opened a small clothing shop on Dalhousie Street. Mary soon realized that Rideau Street had a lot more business opportunities, and they moved the shop to Rideau Street, eventually expanding to include 143 to 147 Rideau. If you look at the bottom right-hand corner, there is a photo of Schaefer's at 147 to 147 and a half. Schaefer's Limited was very much a family business. Abraham and Mary lived above the store and ran it together up until their final years. The children helped with the store, but especially Milton, who had a hand in helping with modernizing the shop. According to his descendants, Milton's approach to doing business was a little more on the modern side and a little creative, which is where something like the stereoscope would come into play. In 1961, Schaefer celebrated 50 years of business. When Abraham passed in 1965, Milton and Sheldon took over the family business and continued to run it for another 2 years. Due to the popularity of malls and convenient shopping, Schaefer's was sold in 1967. The business ended up being sold to Kaplan's, who were, quote, longtime family friends and neighbors on Rideau Street for more than 50 years. The stereo viewer is a really great example of an item that the archives generally wouldn't accept simply because it's a massively produced item and it's 3D. But due to its connection to a Jewish community and a business like Schaefer's, we absolutely had to include it in the collection. So next we have Dina Edelson's tennis racket. The photo on the left-hand side is obviously the tennis racket. So this was owned by Dina Edelson, as I mentioned, and it was used during the 1949 tennis championship when she played for the Tel Aviv Tennis Club. The racket comes complete with a wooden cover, and her name is even carved into the handle, so we absolutely know that it is hers. That's the bottom right-hand corner. You can just see Dina is carved in there. So the Tel Aviv Tennis Club was established in 1935 when Victoria Tennis Club in Vanier was rented out for the summer season. In the early 20th century, tennis clubs were a very popular social setting. Unfortunately, they also tended to be quite anti-Semitic and excluded Jews from joining their clubs. The Tel Aviv Tennis Club was created as a Jewish tennis club to combat this exclusion. Jess Abelson, the first president of the club, wanted the name to reflect its Jewish roots, which is where the name Tel Aviv came from. In their first season, they placed 6th in the Ottawa District Lawn Tennis League. Not long after their first season, they were given the opportunity to purchase their own building. The club was founded in the mid-1930s during the Depression, which meant that many tennis clubs couldn't afford to pay their taxes and had to sell their buildings. The Riverdale Tennis Club on the Rideau River was one of those clubs. The Tel Aviv Tennis Club was able to purchase the building as well as 8 courts, making it their permanent home. In 1946, the Tel Aviv Tennis Club had 194 members, 100 of which were men and 94 were women, splitting it almost down the middle. The club was a popular social scene for the Jewish community. According to Don Abelson, Jess Abelson's son, one of Jess's proudest accomplishments was the 200 marriages that resulted from the club. In 1949, the Tel Aviv Tennis Club was once again involved in the Ottawa District Championships. This is where the tennis racket comes into play. An excerpt from the Ottawa Jewish Bulletin, published on August 18, 1949, states, quote, Eastern C-section champions Tel Aviv swept their way to Ottawa District C honors last night, winning a sudden death playoff with Ottawa champions on the Western Division 4-1. The sole loss came in the women's doubles, the closest fight of the night, Molly Friedman and Dina Edelson putting up a sterling defense, but losing to Betty Henderwick and Angela Rothwell 6-3, 4-6, and 7-5, unquote. Although Dina and her partner did not win the women's division, their participation in the event helped the Tel Aviv Tennis Club to victory in that year. This is another great example of the importance of keeping records. If we didn't know this tennis racket was used in the 1949 championship, then it would just be a tennis racket that Dina had owned. Context is everything, and in this case, I think it makes for a pretty good story. This is a history that I think many people are going to be fairly familiar with. This single beret was given to Lillian Freeman by Frank Potts, the executive secretary for the Royal Canadian Legion, in 1939. It was accompanied by a letter which states that the style of the beret was made specifically for Ottawa servicemen in honor of a visit from the King of England. The letter from Frank also states that he wanted Lillian to have one because, quote, he didn't know of a better and more deserving soldier than Lillian, unquote. For anyone who may not know, Lillian Freeman was the daughter of Moses Bilski, the man considered by many to be one of Ottawa's first Jewish settler. Lillian did a lot, not just for Ottawa's Jewish community, but for Canada in general. She was an extremely involved woman with connections as high up as the Prime Minister, and she used these connections to do a great deal of good in the world. She is most commonly known as the Poppy Lady here in Canada, as she was the one who brought the Poppy campaign to Canada. Every year when we wear those little red poppies for Remembrance Day, we carry a piece of Lillian with us. Now, I could speak about Lillian all night. She is an entire lecture topic all on her own. So for the purposes of this artifact, I'll be going over the highlights of her life that I feel best connect with the beret. So like I mentioned, Lillian was the daughter of Moses and Pauline Bilski. She was the 5th of their 11 children. In 1903, at the age of 18, Lillian attended her first Zionist convention in Montreal, which really set the stage for what would become a lifelong commitment to Zionism, philanthropy, and community involvement. In August of that same year, Lillian married Mr. Archibald Jacob Freeman, also known as AJ, who was a very well-known man in the community, owning Freeman's department store, which, as I have been told by many, many people, had the best malted shakes in the city. Lillian worked tirelessly during the First World War. She hosted a Red Cross sewing circle in her home, which involved installing 30 sewing machines in her living room. Women would come in weekly to make blankets and clothes to be sent overseas to those who were fighting. In 1917, Lillian became concerned with how servicemen would transition back into everyday life after 4 years of fighting over in Europe. Her solution was to create the Great War Veterans Association, which is now known as the Royal Canadian Legion. Once again, Lillian gave up space in her home for the cause. A room in her home was used as the local headquarters office, and she even provided the furnishings. In September of 1918, the Spanish influenza reached Ottawa, and once again, Lillian rose to the occasion. She was asked by the mayor of Ottawa to organize local relief efforts to confront the influenza epidemic, which resulted in her organization of a centralized information book and a continual release of progress reports to keep the public informed. According to the Canadian Encyclopedia, quote, "For 5 weeks, she worked relentlessly with the medical officer of health, Dr. Robert Law. She organized a group of 1,500 volunteers who nursed the sick and provided them with food and clothing. By the time the outbreak came under control, she had earned the love and respect of Ottawans from all walks of life," unquote. 1921 also marked another eventful and philanthropic year for Lillian. In this year, Anna Guerin visited Canada. For anyone who may not know, Guerin was the director of a charity which sold poppy boutonnieres to raise money to help France after the war. Lillian saw huge potential in this, and she decided to bring the poppies to Canada. It's rumored that the first poppies were actually made in her living room, which, based on her ability to share her home with her many causes, really doesn't surprise me at all. The first Poppy Day was on November 11th, 1921. And this year, we will actually be celebrating the 100th anniversary of that. In the same year, Lillian and her husband, AJ, embarked on another adventure. This time it was helping war orphans. In 1920, 137,000 Jewish orphans from Eastern Europe were denied entry to Canada or the United States. Lillian arranged a meeting with Frederick Charles Blair, who was an official with the Department of Immigration and Colonization, and requested that 1,000 Jewish Ukrainian war orphans be allowed to enter Canada. Her first request was met, but 200 orphans were being granted entry. Lillian became the president of the Jewish War Orphans of Canada Committee and began raising money to help place these children in homes. Finally, in 1921, with $100,000 raised, Lillian traveled to Belgium and she transported 150 of those orphans to Canada and placed them in homes. She and AJ even adopted one of the children herself. Lillian received this beret in 1939, 1 year before her death. At that time, she was in a hospital bed. She would never see the end of the Second World War, although I'm sure if she had been given the choice or the chance to continue and do everything she could to help those fighting at home and overseas, she absolutely would have. Even in her final months, Lillian continued to work from her bed. Upon her death, the whole of the community showed up to mourn her loss, and her coffin at the funeral was half covered, in red poppies. She was only 55 when she passed. This beret isn't just a hat that Lillian owned, it's a symbol of who she was as a person. It represents all the good that she did in the world and all the lives that she affected through her generosity and her kindness. I think I have to agree with Mr. Potts that there isn't a more deserving soldier of such an honor. For anyone who's curious, the bottom middle photo is a photo of her coffin being taken out with the poppies on top. So this one here has to be my absolute favorite, or at least one of my absolute favorite items in the collection, mostly because I have a soft spot for pearls. So this set of pearls is a sample tray from Evco Pearls, showing the different styles that he produced in the factory. Nathan Evanchik, who is the gentleman on the right-hand side, was the owner of Evco Pearls. He was born in Minsk, Russia in 1892. Russia at this time was not a very welcoming place for Jewish people. It was a regular host of pogroms, which were violent mob attacks on Jewish neighborhoods. When Nathan was 13, he was sent to live with his aunt in New York City. He arrived at Ellis Island in 1905, and he actually used his brother Mayer's papers to enter into the United States, which is the name that he went by for the rest of the time he was in North America. When Evanchik arrived in the States, he only spoke Yiddish and Russian, which meant job searching was a little bit difficult. He ended up assisting his aunt with preparing meals for garment factory workers. He was an extremely intelligent young man, and he quickly picked up on English as a third language. In fact, he was so proficient in it that within a few years, he was able to pass a university entrance exam. Unfortunately, tuition fees were not something he could afford, and so he decided to travel instead. This decision to travel is ultimately what led him to his pearl business. In 1914, at the age of 22, Evanchik and his cousin made their way to Japan. He liked the country so much that he decided to live there for 8 years. In this time, he and his cousin established a business that sold pearls, jade, fine china, and other products from the East. In 1922, Evanchik returned to North America, but this time he decided to settle in Ottawa, and this is where he remained until his death. It was in this year that he established M. Evanchik Jewelry Limited. His business began as a wholesale business, importing pearl products from Japan and selling them to various department stores. He sold cultured pearls, which was a fairly new concept at the time due to the fact that it was just invented in Japan. So for anyone who may not know, cultured pearls are pearls that have been created by a mussel or oyster farmer within controlled conditions. M. Evanchik Limited is reported to be the first company in Canada to import these pearls. In 1939, with the outbreak of the Second World War, trade supplies were being cut off, including Evanchik's supply of cultured pearls. For any other business owner, this could have been it for them. But Evanchik was an inventive man, and he found a very creative solution. He created a technique that turned finely ground scales of herring into simulated pearls. He designed special dipping and drying machinery, experimented with a variety of different dipping mixtures, and even developed his own dyes for the pearls. By 1941, the company was producing between 700 and 1,000 strings of Evco pearls necklaces per day. And by 1946, Evanchik was the supplier of 75% of the simulated pearl export trade for the United States, the United Kingdom, the British West Indies, Peru, and Brazil. It's reported that the recipe for the pearls was very closely guarded and only ever shared with his son. Evco Pearls finally closed in 2008 after almost 100 years of being open. The tray of pearls that I have on the screen and that we have in the archives is a set of 5 sample strands of pearls, including Evanchik's special Moon Glow pearl, which apparently took almost an entire year to create. For anyone interested, it's the top blue tagged one that for some reason is labeled Moon Mist. So I think out of all of the items I'll be showing you tonight, this one in particular has traveled the farthest, or it's at least had the most interesting journey to Canada. So this abacus traveled with the Borowski family from Russia to Canada, where it was used in the Ottawa butcher shop for more than 25 years. The Borowski family story begins in Russia. Much like Mayor Evanchik, the family lived in Russia during a time when it wasn't safe to be Jewish. In 1913, Wolf Borowski left for Canada in the hopes of escaping military service. He arrived in Canada at what is now known as Pier 21, and he made his way to Ottawa, where he set up a butcher shop in the Byward Market. Once he had settled, he sent a letter to his wife and his daughter back in Russia, telling them that it was time to join him in their new home. On October 24th, 1917, Mrs. Borowski was issued a green leather-bound passport for herself and her 4-year-old daughter, Annie, both of whom are the center photo on the screen. She brought with her a suitcase and 3 or 4 wicker trunks which contained prized possessions, including the family abacus, which had been used in their family butcher shop since before she was born. Due to the current state of the world, Europe in the thralls of the First World War and Russia on the verge of the Revolution of 1917, the trip didn't go as smoothly as it had for her husband. She and Annie boarded the newly completed Trans-Siberian Railway and got ready for the 9,288 kilometer stretch from Moscow to Vladivostok, which by today's train standards is a 7-day trip. It's also the map across the top of the screen. When they arrived in Vladivostok, they went to the United States Consular Building and obtained travel permits to the United States. They then boarded another train that took them to Shanghai and finally onto a boat which took them to Yokohama, Japan. Unfortunately, in Japan, their trip took a turn to the left. Mrs. Bodofsky contracted measles and they were forced to quarantine for 1 month before they could travel again. During this time, they also ran out of money. Luckily, a Japanese man who spoke Russian offered to pay an alien tax, which is a tax required by the United States from every immigrant who enters into the country. With their dues paid, Mrs. Bodofsky and Annie boarded their ship and almost 1 month later landed in Seattle. From there, they boarded a train to Vancouver. The final leg of their journey involved taking the Trans-Canada Railway east towards Ottawa. Finally, on April 1918, after 6 months of travel, the two arrived in Ottawa. The Bodofsky family owned a butcher shop in Ottawa for many years. It was located on York Street in the market before finally moving to 13 Byward Market, which is the old market building. This abacus was used in both the family butcher shop in Russia as well as the one in Ottawa. According to Sylvia Kirschman, who is the daughter of the Bodofskys, this abacus was used before her mother's birth, making it at least 125 years old. All right, this top hat made history in Ottawa. It was worn by Bernard Smith on the occasion of his wedding, and it was the first recorded Jewish wedding in Ottawa. I will say it's in spectacular condition for its age. So Bernard Smith arrived in Canada from Russia in early 1890s. His marriage to Miss Rebecca Reinstein, also known as Mina, in 1894 was performed by Reverend Jacob Mirsky, and it became the first recorded Jewish wedding in the city. The Smiths were among the early Jewish pioneer families in Ottawa, and they became naturalized Canadian citizens in 1902. The Archives has a typed copy of the Ottawa Free Press report on the wedding from November 1st, 1894, and it's entitled Jewish Wedding, Interesting Ceremony at Dalhousie Street Residence, and it reads as follows, quote, "A very pretty Jewish wedding took place last night at the home of Mr. Fine on Dalhousie Street. The high contracting parties were Mr. Smith and Mina Reinstein with the Reverend Rabbi Mirsky as officiating clergymen. The groom was supported by Mr. Fine and Mr. Rubenstein, while the attendants of the bride were Miss Rothschild and Miss Hart. The ceremony was a very interesting and unintended, had a flair of the weird. After the knot had been tied, the guests gave themselves up to merriment. The goblet of wine was broken, and around those present circled again and again at the same time, giving voice to hymns in the Jewish tongue. Dancing was then indulged into the strains of George O'Connor's orchestra, and everyone seemed to enter into the amusement with great delight. Our gathering dispersed after wishing the happy couple many long and prosperous years of wedded bliss," unquote. This is really the only information that we have available on the wedding, aside from, of course, the top hat and the story behind it. Bernard and Mina went on to have 4 children, Essie, Coleman, Jules, and Fanny. And Bernard Smith was a really integral part of the early Jewish life in Ottawa, And not just because he was the first recorded Jewish marriage in the city, but because he was one of the earliest members of Adas Jeshurun, Ottawa's first synagogue. His signature is recorded at a meeting that took place there on April 25th, 1892. So I'm just going to pause here for a second, and we're going to open up the floor to any questions any questions on the last 7 items that I talked about.
Okay, well, nobody has submitted a question to the chat, unfortunately. So let's live dangerously. If anybody has some comments, let's take a minute or two. Hopefully only one person will speak at a time. So if someone wants to start with a question or comment, actually something just came.
I have one.
Okay, Kathy K just asked what the top hat is made of. So
that's a good question. I actually don't know off the top of my head. It looks like a light fur to me, based on what I can see from the photo and from when I looked at it, but I definitely can't speak for certain what it's made of.
Okay. Anybody else want to put a question to the chat or speak up?
I have a comment.
Okay.
It's Snooky Leaf. I still have my first pair of pearl earrings that we bought from Abby Evanchik, who was a neighbor on Sherwood Drive. I would
Oh,
show
that's
them to you,
fantastic.
but they have been in the bank since I went to Florida before the COVID.
That's wonderful. I will tell you, I went through all my pearls and I had my mother go through her pearls just to see if we happened to have one, and we unfortunately didn't. So it's very, very interesting to meet someone who actually has a set of his pearls.
Anybody
have
else out
something.
there? with a
I have
comment?
something. Hi, John.
Hello.
Tegan, I think you know this. I have a letter that I found from Aunt Lillian Freeman
Yes.
to my father when he was a student at Queen's University.
Mhm.
And it starts, "Darling Lawrence, I am really ashamed of myself for not writing to you before, but now that Poppy Day is over, and she crossed out, I will have nothing to do. You can expect to hear from me often." I just thought you'd like to get that view of Aunt Lil.
Oh, that's so sweet. That's
Now
too
that I'll have
lovely.
nothing to do.
I'm sure she picked up something quick.
I think so.
Okay, we do have a question
Yes.
from Natalia, who's wondering if the picture of Mrs. Freeman's coffin was taken on the steps of the synagogue on King Edward. I think it was, looking at this.
Absolutely. It was taken. Let me back up. Nope. Uh-oh.
Going the wrong way.
There we go. Yes, it was. At this point, it was the, again, please forgive my pronunciation, the Heva Kadisha. At this point, it had, no, I'm wrong. Yes, it is the synagogue at this time. You are completely right. It's on the front steps.
It was Adat Yisharun.
Yes,
Pardon?
It was
it was a
adopted.
death insurance. King Edward
Adat
VI.
Yisharun.
Ah. I'm going to sit down one day and I'm going to go through all the words I mispronounce. And I'm going to practice them all day long. Thank you for the correction.
And anything about Lillian Freeman should also include her presidency of Canadian Hidassowitzo for so many years.
Absolutely. Lillian was involved in so many different things. Like I said, she's an entire lecture topic all on her own. I could talk about her for hours. She had so many things that she was a part of.
Okay,
Anyone else, or should we continue?
I guess we'll continue, Tegan.
Fantastic. All right. I've already clicked ahead, so I've spoiled the surprise, but our next one is our pawnbroker clock. So this is probably the largest item that the archives houses, and it stands at about 4 feet tall. This pawnbroker sign was originally outside of D. Wolfson's watchmaker business, which was located at 111 Clarence Street in the Market in the early 1920s. When Wolfson closed his shop, he gave the clock to Sam Nathanson, who owned a pawn shop at 41 William Street. After serving in the Second World War, Louis Nathanson joined his father in the business, and they had the sign modified to read pawnbroker across it, which you can see from all the photos. And at the bottom, he also added the pawnbroker symbol, which is the 3 spears suspended from the bar, which you can see in all 3 photos there. So in 1946, Sam Nathanson's daughter Sylvia married Bertram Bronzer, and they continued to operate the business with Sylvia's brother Louis under the name of Sam's Buy and Sell. Musical instruments were a popular addition to the business, and it eventually became its principal commodity. The name then changed to Sam's ABC Music, and in the 1980s, the business moved from the Byward Market to Bank Street at Alta Vista. At the time of the relocation, the sign was removed from Sylvia and Bert, and for the next it was removed by Sylvia and Bert, pardon me, and for the next several years, it was kept in their care. In 2009, the Ottawa Jewish Historical Society had the sign restored by Paul Champion Demers and then was donated to the Ottawa Jewish Archives. It is considered to be a really important piece, historic artifact, and it represents the early Jewish businesses in Ottawa's Byward Market. Today, a replica of David Wolfson's clock stands in the Byward Market, quote, celebrating market time gone by many merchants and businessmen that contributed to the growth and economic success of the Byward market. And for anyone interested, the bottom photo there is D. Wolfson's in the early 20s. All right, so I know for a fact that almost every single person on this call has a story or a memory related to these bottles in some way. So for the sake of this, I will keep this one quite short because I'm pretty sure you guys have more to tell me in terms of memories than I have for you. So these bottles are from Pure Spring Company Limited, an Ottawa Jewish soft drink owned company that was started in the early 1920s. In 1894, Jacob Mirsky arrived in Ottawa after being invited by Adam's congregation, pardon me again. For anyone who is paying attention, this is the same Jacob Mirsky who married Bernard and Mina Smith. Originally from New York City, Jacob was chosen to become Ottawa's first rabbi, bringing his son along with him. And that's a photo of Jacob and his 4 children there, including his son, David. So David was the son of Jacob, and as a young teenager in Ottawa, he found he had an entrepreneurial spirit among other business endeavors. It was rumored that David would return glass bottles to Brading's Brewery for spare change. David soon noticed a small spring on Nanny Goat Hill that provided people with a fresh and clean water supply. David took this opportunity and he began bottling the water from the spring and selling it to thirsty customers. This was the start of Pure Spring. He soon struck a business deal with Brading's Brewery, which gave him the rights to this spring water, and it allowed him to build a small base of operations near the brewery on LeBreton Flats. David's company was originally called the Ottawa Bottle and Trading Co., and its first products were large cans of water. In the early 1920s, ginger ale began to be imported from England, giving him the idea to create a new line of soft drinks. In 1927, the company's name was changed to Pure Spring Company Limited. Operations and hierarchical structure within the corporation was pretty simple. Horses and sleds were originally used for product delivery and transport. Mirsky was the corporation's president, and his 3 sons worked on separate tasks individually. So Norman focused on developing new products, Mervyn was tasked with sales and merchandise, while John worked on promotion. As the company grew and profits soared, they began to use trucks for transport and more modern production equipment. Pure Spring Company began to expand at an unprecedented rate, and their soft drinks could be found from the Maritimes all the way into Alberta. The corporation was sold to Crush International in the mid-1960s. So plants were opened on Belfast Road and Aberdeen Street, with annual sales hitting about $50 million range. International sales also materialized as Pure Spring sodas were found in the United States, Bermuda, and the Dominican Republic. Even though the company now belonged to Crush International, Mervyn Mirsky continued to run this business up until about 1987. The Archives has 6 bitter lemon Jenny bottles, as you can see on the screen, and 2 ginger ale bottles, including one that is not opened. I really try not to handle this item for obvious reasons. We also have a crate in the Archives that has the logo on it, as well as some paper cups from the company. So this sheet of paper with signatures may not look like much, but it's representative of the good someone did in the world. This piece of paper contains close to 50 signatures of Jewish men and women that Ari von Mansum saved during the Holocaust or Shoah. So Ari was born in Holland on March 5th, 1920. He was the second of 4 children born to the von Mansums. In 1933, the same year that Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, Ari began to notice the effects of anti-Semitism. New Jewish students started attending his high school, and they told stories about the rise of anti-Semitism in their countries. They and their families had fled Germany to avoid Nazis and persecution. On May 10th, 1940, the Germans invaded the Netherlands. The next couple of months saw a lot of changes in occupied Holland. Curfews were enforced, rations were being put in place, and news was becoming heavily censored. In the spring of 1941, Ari got a job working as a traveling salesman. This position meant that he had a railway pass, which allowed him to travel more freely after German occupation in the Netherlands. He was soon approached by Dirk von Assen, who was a man working in the underground, and asked Ari if he would help with further distributing Free Netherlands, an underground newspaper using his railway pass. Ari, of course, agreed. In the summer of 1942, he was approached by the underground resistance again to assist this time with finding places for Jews to hide. The first family he helped were the Schatz family. They had found a place to hide, but they had to take the train to their location, and they were frightened to travel alone. Ari met with the family before their departure, and they came up with a plan. He instructed them to leave their home slightly before sundown with their yellow stars loosely sewn to the coats. On the afternoon of their departure, Ari met them at their home, and they walked with them to the train station. Once they had arrived at the station, Ari instructed them to hold up a large newspaper, rip off the stars, and stick them in their pockets. Once they had boarded the train, everyone split up. Mother and daughter went in one compartment, while Ari and the father went into another one. 4 hours later, they arrived at their destination safe. This trip scared Ari. Despite their safe arrival, they had been lucky. As they boarded the train, Ari realized that he had failed to get fake identification cards for everyone. All that they had were their real ones, which were stamped with a large J, signifying that they were Jewish. It was a tense 4 hours, but luckily, no one had stopped to ask for their IDs. After that, Ari always came prepared with forged identification cards and food stamps when they were needed or requested. Ari continued to find safe hiding places for Jews in the community. His family even hid Fritz Froelich, who was a Jew of the same age as Ari, and hid them in his home until liberation in 1945. In 1943, Ari was arrested by the Gestapo. Until the end of the war, he was placed in several concentration camps before being court-martialed and questioned about his activities working for the underground. In 1945, Ari was liberated by the Canadian Armed Forces and returned home, where he was met with a hero's welcome. In 1945, the small surviving group of Jews, most of whom had survived because of Ari, had an oil painting done for him and a celebration honoring him as a hero in the room adjoining their synagogue. At the celebration, he was given a scroll with the signatures of those he helped to save. On the screen, I've included the list of signatures as well as the photo of Ari with most of the people he helped to hide and save. All right, so this Torah book sat inside Ottawa's first synagogue for almost 100 years. It's from our very first congregation and synagogue. On July 25th, 1904, Aaron Rosenthal laid the cornerstone for what became Ottawa's first synagogue and home of the Archivist Teigan congregation. I apologize, everyone. The synagogue served as a staple to the community for almost 100 years, and in the time commemorated bar and bat mitzvahs, weddings, deaths, births, and holidays. So the congregation was formed in 1829 by Moses Bilski. For a couple of years, gatherings were hosted by Moses, either in his home or his daughter Lillian's home. This again is Lillian Freeman. In the early days, when there were just a few families in the city, services of the Bilskis worked out just fine. But with more families started to move to Ottawa, they began to outgrow their space and began seeking a different location. In 1895, the congregation bought a small wooden building located in the Byward Market at 264 Murray Street. This location, however, did not last long. As it turned out, the building next door was a food processing plant, and their staple product was pork and beans, which, as you can imagine, made for a less than ideal situation next to a synagogue. In 1893, a plot of land had been purchased for the building of a synagogue. In 1904, the plans for the building had been completed for what is now known as the King Edward Street Shul. The building is a 3-story red brick with 2 large onion-shaped domes on the top that resemble architecture commonly used in mosques and Eastern Orthodox churches. The window shapes, which is common in synagogues, were shaped to be square at the bottom and rounded on the top so that they resemble the 10 Commandments. The inside of the synagogue consisted of a vaulted white ceiling, ornate hanging lanterns etched with the Star of David, and a second-floor balcony made of steel banisters and wooden columns. The balcony opens to the east, where the morning light would pour in through the stained glass windows towards Jerusalem. This is where the Torah would sit. The balcony was where the women used to sit and men used to sit below in the main sanctuary. During the first half of the 20th century, this served as the principal Orthodox congregation. It was during this time that the Torah book was donated to the congregation, and according to our records, it was presented by Mr. and Mrs. William Holzman in 1938, which you can also see the inscription on the front of the Torah book, which is the photo on the left-hand side. Whoops, we're not done just yet. So the final thing that I would like to talk to everybody about tonight is this archives certificate. This certificate represents the reason the archives exists. It was given to Mrs. Shirley Berman at the completion of her archival training in 1983. So as many of you know, Shirley is the archives founder and our first archivist. She is the whole reason we are all able to sit here tonight and discuss all the wonderful things that are inside the archives. Shirley was born in Toronto in 1930 to Baruch and Helena Hetler. Shirley met her husband Shire Berman in Toronto through their shared Zionist youth organization interests. The two married on May 24th, 1951 in Toronto. In 1957, Shire started working at the National Research Council and the two relocated to Ottawa. Shirley quickly realized that Ottawa's Jewish history was not being preserved, and she took it upon herself to make sure that it was. She attended classes on archival management, ultimately gaining this certificate and continuing to volunteer at the National Library of Canada, and began collecting our precious documents and photos for our future archive. Shirley was insistent on using proper materials and spaces, actively seeking out our history so that it was being preserved and studied for years to come. When the Murray Street Synagogue was scheduled for demolition, Shirley went out and found sponsors and restoration specialists to ensure that the beautiful murals were being preserved. Those murals now sit in the lobby of the JCC for everyone to enjoy. I've said it before, and I will say it again, the archives would not exist without Shirley. For many years, she was a quiet hero. Her forethought and passion for the archives can be seen in the carefully maintained collection in the vault today. Shirley passed away on September 2nd, 2019, just 2 months before I started at the archives. Although she had retired from the archives for more than 20 years, earlier in 1998, I'm told that she would frequently pop in and check on the archives just to see how things were going. This certificate represents Shirley's passion. There are many, many archives in this country that were started by volunteers with good intentions who collected things and then just tossed them in boxes. Shirley was different. She made a point of educating herself on proper standards, of learning what would give our records the best possible conditions. She's the reason the archives is in such a wonderful state. And then again, I'm able to share all these things with you. She set the standard from day one, and this certificate is absolute proof of that. So for that, and for the presentation, thank you, Shirley, for the legacy that you have left us. All right, so that
Teigan,
yeah,
can you put me on the screen?
Sure. I just have a couple more words to say. Is that okay, Ellie?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, so that concludes the presentation, everyone. I just wanted to take a moment to say thank you to the Ottawa Jewish Historical Society for giving me the opportunity to share all of these wonderful items that we have housed in the archives. I would also like to thank the families of the artifacts, families and donors of the artifacts that I was able to speak about tonight, not only for your donation of the item, but for having the forethought to record the history and to keep them safe and donate them to us in the end. Preserving our history is one of the easiest ways to ensure our legacy. And finally, I would like to thank you all so much for listening to me talk about the archives for what's been almost an hour at this point. I am blown away by the response. I can't believe how many people were on here and so interested in listening to me talk about artifacts. So thank you again so much, everyone. I will now open up the floor. Actually, I'll pass it on to Ellie.
Teigan,
Thank you very much. Hello.
Teigan,
Yes, Ellie.
I would like to, on behalf of the Ottawa Jewish Historical Society, thank you for this fantastic presentation tonight. Some of us watched it a few days ago for the first run through, and it was interesting to watch it again. Thank you very much. I just want to make a couple of comments. One is for those who don't know, the archives is separate from the Ottawa Jewish Historical Society. Teigan works Monday to Thursday for the archives. We have been very fortunate to have her work on Fridays for the Ottawa Jewish Historical Society. So if anybody wants to ever reach someone on Fridays, we have Teigan working for us, and you can reach her at the office. The other thing that we did start this year is a newsletter. And if you contact Teigan, approximately every 6 to 8 weeks, there is a newsletter that goes out from the Jewish Historical Society, and Teigan will be more than happy to add you to our mailing list. So again, Teigan, I know that took a lot of work, and your passion for all things archive is pretty evident. We all enjoy working with you, and thank you again for this great presentation. And now I'll open it to John and questions.
Yes,
Okay.
bring them on.
Ellie Bolograph, you
Yes.
indicated that you'd like to make some comments, so if
Hi,
you're not
Ellie.
unmuted.
Yes, I do. Thank you very much. Hi, Teigan.
Hi, how are you?
I'm okay. First of all, I want to say I came in late, so unfortunately, I forgot about it. And so I missed a lot. And I really regret that very much because this is obvious and amazing work you've put together. I say two comments. One,
Yes.
there was somebody who asked whether any survivors in Ottawa, and of course, blah, blah. Yes, I don't think that was really covered in your presentation. But the other
I didn't.
two things I want to mention is that, first of all, Ari Van Mansom, that amazing person who was, of course, of the Christian faith, but because of his work, his conviction, he very much felt part of the Jewish community. And I don't think that was known at all for many, many years. People did want to, go to his company for insurance, but I'm afraid that we kind of missed out on that a bit because he used to come and visit me. And I think just being here in the living room with me was very, very important to him because he had been so involved with the Jewish people. And I wanted you to know that. The other point I want to mention that when we came to Canada in 1951 as Holocaust survivors, we lived in a small town, first Stonefield and then Grenville, but we used to shop in Hawkesbury. And because the people soon found out there were Jews who had arrived from Holland, were living in Grenville. And these people, although they didn't do an awful lot for us, in fact, the fact that they were there, we were the only Jews survivors in this little town, but there were people in Hawkesbury, the Seversky who owned a hardware shop, the Cohen family who owned a ladies' shop and a men's shop in Hawkesbury, and a movie theater in Brownsburg. There's the Chronic family from Van Cleek Hill. And all these people had significance in my life because they all sort of, I'll tell you shortly, Mr. Fisher owned a pharmacy in Hawkesbury, and Mrs. Wolkoff, who came later on, and she taught Hebrew for a little while. And these people extended themselves, and I feel it's very unfortunate. I know you only had time to deal with the people in Ottawa, but there were so many Jews who lived in the surroundings that have been completely forgotten about, are not acknowledged, that have done things for the Jewish community and for the rest of the Canadian society. They played a huge role. And I just want to give credit to these people by mentioning this to you. I hope that this is being recorded because Mrs. Chronic, for example, played piano one day when she invited me and one of my sisters. The Cohen family, I got hand-me-downs from their one daughter who wore something new every day from the store. So occasionally I would get some fancy clothing that my mother couldn't afford. To Severskys, who owned the hardware shop, all these people kind of acknowledged us. Not that they did a lot, but it was nice to know we who were survivors, there were Jews who cared that we were there. And Mr. Fisher, I remember the story was that he had been a spy in Russia. When I was 12 years old, I heard this. Anyway, that's what I wanted to contribute, that there were so many amazing people out there. And I would like to think that their history is not forgotten.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that. It's important to acknowledge that, to say it, and we are recording it right now. So
thank you.
We have it in words, and because we're recording it, you can also catch the beginning, Ellie.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ellie. Evelyn Greenberg asked about the list. Where did these people sign their names? Where did all these people gather and sign their names to the document?
So after the war, they all returned back to their hometown in Holland, and I guess I can't remember if the synagogue was still left standing or if they had rebuilt a new one, but they had all met together. They had a big celebration for Ari, and it was in that room when they were having the celebration and presenting him with the painting of himself that they had all signed the piece of paper and then given it to him that way. So he had a list of everybody that he had saved.
Okay. And he visited people in Israel afterwards. win
Yes.
award, and
Yes.
an enormous outpouring of fondness, and they wanted him to stay there. Of course, he had to go back to Holland.
He was named righteous among the nations, which is why he was in Israel for a time
Yes.
accepting that award.
Okay, David Kimmel put a reference to a biography of Bertha Lehman Rosenthal on the founding of the King Edward Synagogue.
Perfect.
The link to the biography is in the comments section. So if you go there, you can find it.
Perfect.
Natalia asked if we could repeat the address of the shop on Clarence. I think it was 113, if I'm guessing.
I have seen 111 and I've seen 113, so it was one of the two.
All right, okay. Terry, you wanted to say something about Shirley Berman?
Yes, I did. Teigan has spoken glowingly about her. There's not too much more that can be said, except that her dedication to the Ottawa Jewish Archives was really something extraordinary. I had the very good fortune to speak with her 3 days before she died. She could barely talk. I called and her son David let me speak with her. And I told her I was calling to check to see how she was and that I wished her well. And we had a very short conversation, but she knew exactly what was going on.
Let's move on to Lois Leaf, who has a little anecdote about Pure Spring.
Yeah, my parents were very friendly with Norman and Ann Mirsky, and we were neighbors of Jack and Marion. I was a little kid at the time, but I remember a gathering in our living room during World War II when there was a sugar shortage. And they came up with a scheme to bottle ginger. We called Norman Mirsky ginger ale. To bottle it sugarless with a little recipe for adding your own sugar syrup to the beverage when you open it.
Was it any good?
Sure.
Good.
I was very sorry when they went out of business. I loved their ginger.
I have never had a chance to try the soda, but from every person I've heard, it was just amazing.
Yeah, my favorite was honey orange.
That sounds good, actually.
And of course, gin and Jenny.
That's right. I think we've covered all of the questions. You know, the Mirsky name came up quite a bit in the presentation under a couple of categories. And if I can do something that's a little, well, maybe I won't. But yeah, there's a great article that I've seen in an archival newspaper from 1904 that talks about one of the first Jewish funerals in Ottawa. And what's really interesting about it is that the Jews were a novelty back in those days. And so it describes the strange customs of the Jews pertaining to funerals. And maybe I'll give it to Teigan and she can post it on maybe the archive site and the historical Facebook pages.
Absolutely.
And it's the funeral of Jacob Mirsky's daughter, who died in 1904.
Yeah, the newspapers had really interesting wordings for that sort of thing at the time. Even I read that portion from the Smith wedding, and they said, the unintended was weird, or something of the sort. They just, I guess, weren't used to that.
I did find that article. If there is some interest, I can just put it on the screen. I think
go for it.
Okay. Okay, so can you see this?
Yep.
Okay, so this is from the Ottawa Journal from May of 1904. And it talks about how Sarah Mirsky, who was Jacob Mirsky's daughter, died. And of course, if you read in the first paragraph, in the custom of the Hebrews, was buried immediately. And it talks about how she was the body was washed and she was enclosed in white robes, taken to the cemetery on Metcalf Road, which is the Bank Street Cemetery. And I'll have you know that nobody knows where that grave is in the Bank Street Cemetery. It's one of a number of people that have been buried there in the last 120 or so years, that I guess the graves were not marked and we just don't know where they are. But it's a very interesting article, and you know, it really shows how much of a novelty the Jewish people were in Ottawa, you know, at the beginning of the 20th century. So, and I'll send that to Teigan so she can maybe post it.
Yes, please do.
Hi.
Hi, Ellie.
I wanted to say, I thought it was cute. I read that article quickly as you showed it. It talked about afterwards, the company partook of bread and liquor. It looked like we had an Irish funeral or something there. Obviously, it was wine, and they said liquor. If you read the article,
Yeah.
it's kind of funny. Thank you.
Okay, David Kimmel, another great historian, just gave us a link to an article about, he's talking about the Jacob Mirsky Fonds in the archives that has records about Sarah Mirsky's funeral. So that's in the Canadian Jewish Heritage Network website.
That would be us then.
Okay, any other comments, questions? Teigan, you did a great job.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Final words from Terry, or? Good. Okay, so are we ready to adjourn?
I think so. Once again, thank you all so much for listening. It's so appreciated.
And thank you, Teigan, for doing such a wonderful
There's a
job.
person who has a question. Oh, no, sorry.
Okay, so I guess we'll end this. Thank you all for coming, and please stay tuned for future events put on by the Ottawa Jewish Historical Society. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.